All right, so we get to the final part of this lesson, and that is the reproductive system. So reproduction is I say everything is very interesting because I think biology is absolutely fascinating. Here we are looking at a blank screen, so I guess I'll just, I'll doodle while I'm talking to you. So the reproduction that happens in humans is a little bit different than the reproduction that happens in other animals. So I'm going to start with the male reproductive system first because it is so much simpler to explain. And then once you have that, that innate knowledge of negative feedback and antagonism and hormones and all that other stuff that they do, then we can go to the female reproductive system. And I expect that there'll be lots of questions, so please do feel free to ask. So this doodling has absolutely nothing to do with my lesson here. I just wanted to be doing something so you're not just staring at a blank screen. And I think it was a marvelous doodle, don't you? Okay. So, male reproductive system. In grade 11, we learned that there's a thing called spermatogenesis, meiosis, right? So we learned about meiosis. Meiosis. And meiosis is going to produce, at the end of it, either sperm or eggs. And these are haploid. And eventually they'll meet each other, and you'll get fertilization, and you'll end up with a diploid zygote. So this is one of the things we learned in grade 11. Okay, so our question is, how does that process even come to be? So let's start with the male. We are talking about a hormonal process. So what part of the body is this going to start in? As I ask these questions, don't just blindly follow, say the answer, right? I can't hear you, so you don't have to worry about being wrong or right? So if you said hypothalamus, excellent. If you didn't, okay, hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is the place that's going to control the master gland. So we have our master gland that's made up of two parts, as you might recall, the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary, which I'm going to label. I'm going to try AP. All right. So the anterior pituitary is going to release, there's two gonad-related hormones. One of them is the luteinizing hormone, and the other one is the follicle-stimulating hormone. Both of these get their names for what they do in the female, not for what they do in the male. So the anterior pituitary is going to release this hormone known as the follicle-stimulating FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH. And down here, there's one part in the male body that's responsible for producing sperm. I'm thinking what these are called. They're testes. Okay. So in the testes, there's a number of different cells. And one of the types of cells are the Sertoli cells. So the Sertoli cells, they have a receptor for the follicle-stimulating hormone. The follicle-stimulating hormone is going to go everywhere in the body. It goes to your toes, it goes to your fingers, it goes everywhere. But the only place that has receptors for the follicle-stimulating hormone are the Sertoli cells. The Sertoli cells is where spermatogenesis occurs. Okay? So spermatogenesis is going to occur here. But the Sertoli cells also need another hormone in order to undergo spermatogenesis, the production of sperm. The anterior pituitary also releases another hormone known as luteinizing hormone. Also gets its name for what it does in the female. And it's going to stimulate the Leydig cells. It causes the Leydig cells to release testosterone. So we heard that. Testosterone. So this is a steroid hormone. The testosterone is going to be responsible for a whole bunch of secondary sexual characteristics. So this will be the enlarging of the larynx and increased muscle mass and other things. That's not important for what we're talking about. Importantly, it also stimulates the Sertoli cells. So the FSH and the testosterone together cause the Sertoli cells to undergo a process known as spermatogenesis. And so you get the production of sperm. We're good. So do you need to produce sperm constantly? No. When you have enough sperm, you want it to stop. So what would be a good indicator to stop the production of sperm? If you said FSH, that would be a poor guess. If you said LH, that would also be poor. Testosterone is a great answer. Testosterone will come back and it will inhibit the anterior pituitary. Now, there's a part of the story missing. What's going to cause the pituitary to release these hormones? The hypothalamus. How does the hypothalamus control the anterior pituitary? It controls it through this special hormone known as GnRH. There's that RH again, the releasing hormone. So this is the gonadotropin releasing hormone, and it's going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release these two hormones. So coming back to testosterone, testosterone is going to inhibit the anterior pituitary, and it will inhibit the hypothalamus as well, as expected. And the Sertoli cells, they also release a hormone. So this is a new one. It releases something called inhibin, which totally makes sense. Inhibin inhibits something. Okay, that's brilliant. It's nice when science uses terms that make sense. So this is another classic example of negative feedback. So this, along with the thyroid, along with the antagonistic calcitonin parathyroid and the glucagon and insulin, so many negative feedbacks that you can refer to. So this brings us to the female. So the female is much more complex. The female, in addition to producing the egg, also needs to prepare the uterus for egg implantation. Now, females in the class will know that this is a complex process. This is something that goes through a cycle that is about once every month. But this is not true of every single mammal. There are some mammals that will undergo a cycle, but instead of releasing and sloughing off the endometrium in a menstrual cycle, they will just reabsorb those blood vessels and those cells and those tissues back into their body. So they don't even have a menstrual cycle. Humans are actually one of the few mammals that has a menstrual cycle. All the other mammals rely on a different cycle, an estrous cycle. Also, many other mammals are only receptive at a particular time of year, spring. And if it's not spring, then everything's shut down. But anyway, we're focusing on the human, and I can't really go into a lot of detail because we're shortening this lesson. So, with the female, there are two major cycles that we're going to focus on. These two cycles work with each other, but they are different cycles. One of them is the ovarian cycle, and the other one is the uterine cycle. The ovarian cycle focuses on the ova, or the egg. The uterine cycle focuses on the uterus, or the endometrium. These two cycles need to work with each other. If the egg is ready and it gets fertilized and the uterus isn't ready, then it's not going to work. If the uterus gets ready for an egg that's never going to come, then that seems to be a lot of wasted energy. So these two cycles do work in conjunction, but they are separate cycles that are controlled slightly differently. So where does the story begin? You may know that at the beginning, when the baby is still within the mother's womb, she has all her eggs. As a matter of fact, she has about, you want to guess? I'll give you a moment. How many eggs do you think a baby has before it's even born? Right? If you said somewhere in the vicinity of 6,000, you're wrong. 6 million, yes. By the time the baby's born, and many of those eggs have been lost. So by the time the baby's born, there's about 1 million eggs. And then by the time you hit puberty, there's even more loss. So you're losing a certain number of eggs per day. So by the time you hit puberty, you're down to about 300,000, which is still plenty. Because of those 300,000, very few of them are actually going to come to a place where the egg can potentially be fertilized. So inside the ovary, you're going to see is where the eggs are kept. And the eggs undergo the first round of meiosis, and then they're kind of frozen in between meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. And then upon a certain trigger, though, a certain number of these eggs will be released, and they may undergo a process for them to mature. Okay, so that's the process we're going to look at and explore. I'm going to use a few things here to help me out with this, right? So this cycle that I called up here, and I said the uterine cycle, the proper name that most of you are familiar with is not the uterine cycle. Most of you would call this the menstrual cycle. Okay. So the menstrual cycle, the uterine cycle, and the ovarian cycle. These two cycles work together. Okay. So the ovaries at puberty have about 300,000 eggs. And they're all locked in the first meiotic division. So somewhere between prophase and in there, they're frozen. And then at puberty, after you hit puberty, every month from there on, some of the cells, one or more, typically a bunch of them, will undergo meiosis, and off they go. I'm going to use this here to help me explain the story, and then I'm going to draw and use steps here. So step number 1. What's going to tell the hypothalamus that it needs to release hormones? Some of these are psychological influences that will affect the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is controlling the area. And so if you're stressed, which is a psychological influence, or it could be a physical stress or an emotional stress, that could cause the hypothalamus to stop releasing certain hormones, and then your whole cycle stops. There's also environmental influences. I don't know if you know this, you're more likely to see this if you go off to university, and a lot of girls will be in the same dorm or residence together, and they'll find that their cycles will begin to align because you release chemicals, believe it or not, that are in the air, kind of like pheromones, that the other females in the abode will pick up, and you don't smell it, but your body detects it, and it causes your cycles to align. So there's environmental influences as well as psychological influences. But once everything's ready to go, then we have the first hormone that's released. So just like in the male, the gonadotropin releasing hormone is released by the hypothalamus, and this will stimulate the pituitary gland. This will then cause the pituitary gland to release two hormones, FSH and LH. The FSH and the LH both go throughout the body, but the LH has no home. It just floats around and disintegrates. Nothing happens. But the FSH has receptors found in the ovaries on the follicles. So inside the ovaries is these little tiny follicles that house the ovas and the oocyte. And the follicle stimulating hormone, like any stimulating hormone, will cause that target to be stimulated and to grow. So the follicle will get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And as it gets bigger, it will only have receptors for follicle stimulating hormone. It will release a hormone, estrogen, and estrogen will go over to the uterus and cause the uterus to develop a blood vessels and tissue on the inside. So that's called the endometrium. So the endometrium inside the uterus is stimulated by the growing follicle, which releases estrogen. This estrogen has another effect. It negatively inhibits the pituitary, causing the FSH to come out more slowly than you might expect, and the LH to come out slowly as well. But this only happens when there is a very small concentration of estrogen. Eventually, when the follicle hits a certain size, it has the right concentration of estrogen that will stimulate the hypothalamus. So instead of negatively inhibiting, it will stimulate the hypothalamus. And by stimulating the hypothalamus, it will cause the surge in GnRH, which will cause a surge in FSH, which has been doing its thing the whole time, and a surge in LH. When a surge in LH occurs, at this point, the follicle actually has receptors for the luteinizing hormone. And the luteinizing hormone will cause the follicle to rupture, which is called ovulation. The egg gets released, and now the follicle transforms. It luteinizes into the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to release a combination of estrogen and progesterone. And this combination will negatively inhibit the pituitary and the hypothalamus, so they no longer release as much GnRH or the other gonad hormones from the pituitary gland. This reduction will cause the, if the egg's not implanted, so if the egg's implanted, everything changes. But if the egg is not implanted, this reduction will eventually cause the certain things to occur. The corpus luteum will get smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually it will disintegrate. When it disintegrates, it will no longer release progesterone, and then right after that happens, the hypothalamus and pituitary is able to release, able to stimulate the production of GnRH and FSH. So I wanted us to go over the overview with this particular format, and now I'm going to explain it using a drawing. Okay, so you have this one format, and now I'm going to explain it using the drawing, and hopefully between the two it'll make more sense to you. Okay, so let me just scroll down here. So first step, we have the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is attached to the pituitary. The hypothalamus releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone. The gonadotropin-releasing hormone causes the release of both LH and FSH. When we go to our ovaries, let me just grab our ovaries up here. This is the thing I want smaller. I don't know why I can't make it. Anyway, so the LH, what it was going to do is it's going to go to the ovaries, and it's going to cause the follicle to be stimulated. So here it shows one follicle, but it's often several follicles. So this follicle will be stimulated by the LH, by the FSH. So the FSH will stimulate the follicle, get bigger. And as it gets bigger, it's going to release estrogen. Right? So this little tiny thing is going to release a little bit of estrogen, and the estrogen is going to negatively inhibit the anterior pituitary and negatively inhibit up here. The estrogen is also going to stimulate the uterus and cause the inside of the uterus to start building up blood vessels. Okay, so that's what the estrogen is doing. And so the follicle stimulating hormone is then going to cause the follicle to get larger and larger. And each time it gets larger, more estrogen is being released. At this point, it's still not enough. At this point, it's still not enough. But when you get to a certain size, so let's say about here, the estrogen is no longer playing an inhibitory role. It's now playing an excitatory role. So the estrogen released here will now cause a spike, right? It's now going to stimulate estrogen here. So notice you can't jump into this lesson halfway. You have to start from the beginning and see what's happening. So this big giant follicle here is going to now stimulate the hypothalamus and cause it to release even more gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is going to cause it to release even more FSH, but more importantly, LH. So this has been activated by this big giant surge. And at this point, the follicle has these little receptors for LH. And so the LH is going to cause the follicle to rupture. It's going to rupture. The ova is going to move on, and hopefully it can make it somewhere where it can be fertilized or not. And then the follicle is going to be luteinized, and it's going to transform into this corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is another gland. It's a temporary gland inside the female's ovaries. And what that does is it will release a new hormone, progesterone. And so this progesterone and estrogen together cause even greater vascularization of the uterus, getting it ready for the egg implantation that might make it there. This combination also will inhibit itself. So the combination of estrogen and progesterone together, so progesterone, will inhibit the release of GnRH and inhibit the release of these. So they're not completely erased, there's just less of them. Right? There's just less of it. The corpus luteum, what's going to happen is it's going to, because it's not getting as much luteinizing hormone, it's not being stimulated. So over time, it's going to decrease and decrease, and eventually it's going to break apart. And as it breaks apart, the amount of progesterone and estrogen being released are going to be smaller. And eventually, there's going to be such a small amount of progesterone released that this negative inhibition that was happening is going to stop. And when this progesterone is no longer inhibiting the pituitary and the hypothalamus, and when it's no longer in high enough concentration, it's going to cause several things to occur. One, it's going to cause the sloughing off of this interior of the uterus. We call that the endometrium. Endometrium. So it sloughs off. And so that's menstrual flow. And the negative inhibition that was happening before, that's all gone. So now that it's gone, it means that the body is freely able to, just erase all this stuff now because it's all done. Right. So now it's free to produce the LH again, gonadotropin releasing hormone, the LH, which isn't going to do anything, and the FSH, which will stimulate the next in line. And the whole process starts over again. So that's the beginning of the ovarian cycle again, and once the flow happens, then the estrogen will cause the uterus to do its thing again, and it goes on and on and on and on. So that's the process. That's what's happening in the ovarian and menstrual cycles. So I would like to show you, before I sign off here, this graph. Because this graph is something that you should be familiar with. I just need to find it. Hopefully I have it on here. Okay, it's not the best graph, but it's okay. So let's take a look at what's happening. You should be able to relate the follicular phase of the cycle and the luteal phase of the cycle, right? So this is what's happening with the ovaries. And so let's take a look at the hormones. As we look at the process here, let's try that again. Here, copy that. There we go. All right, so let's try to match up what just happened with this graph. So we have the release of luteinizing hormone. And so the luteinizing hormone is represented by this pink. The blue is representing the follicle stimulating hormone. So the follicle stimulating hormone, over the course of time, it's released, and it's pretty constant. And it stimulates the follicle. And so the follicle will release estrogen. And as the follicle gets bigger, notice how the estrogen level here, let me use a highlighter. Notice how the estrogen level here goes up. That's because the follicle is getting bigger. Okay? And you get to a certain point where there's just enough estrogen, that concentration is just right, that it causes a activation of the, or positive feedback if you want, of the hypothalamus and the pituitary. At that point, the follicle also has receptors for the luteinizing hormone. So you see this surge. This surge happens because the gonadotropin releasing hormone is high and stimulating. So when we take a look at the luteinizing hormone, there's that surge that happens. And you also see a little surge in the follicle stimulating hormone because of the gonadotropin releasing hormones are activating everybody. And so right after that surge occurs right here, that's where the ovulation event occurs. And after this, the follicle now transforms into the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum also releases estrogen, which you can see, right? But the estrogen level's gone down slightly. That's because the follicle released more estrogen than the corpus luteum does. But it still releases estrogen. But more importantly, the progesterone level here, notice how it goes up. That's because the corpus luteum releases progesterone. And the corpus luteum is releasing progesterone, which is mixing with the estrogen, and the two in combination are inhibiting these hormones here. So these other hormones here that are being inhibited due to that combination. So that's why they're so low. They're at their lowest. But as the corpus luteum finally disintegrates, then you'll see that the estrogen and the progesterone, they both decrease, and they finally decrease so much that the whole thing shuts down, the whole process stops. The follicle stimulating hormone, the luteinizing hormone can then restart their process. Okay? When you look at the uterus, you'll see that the estrogen right here, so this is near the beginning, causes the development of blood vessels, and then the progesterone causes more vascularization, and then more vascularization. But when you lose those two hormones, then you get the sloughing off of the inside of the uterus, and then the whole process starts again. Right? So you should be able to relate what's happening between the ovarian cycle, which is this, the uterine cycle, the menstrual cycle, which is this, and all those hormones. This is complicated, but if you understand this, then you understand endocrine system, and you understand the relationship of one hormone to the next. So this explanation I have put on my your worksheet, so you guys can work through that and make sure. I think the best way to understand this is just to draw it out and explain it to somebody. So if you can draw it out and explain what's happening, then you'll be set. If you need help understanding the process, then I encourage you to ask. On the worksheet, you'll see that I've given you this diagram. Shows the LH and FSH. It shows the ovarian cycle and the follicle and the ova. It shows the corpus luteum, and it shows the combination of estrogen and progesterone and what they're doing, along with the development of the inside wall of the uterus. Right? So all those things together on a single document, that's pretty typical for most of the research that you'll see online. All right, so I'm done. That's the endocrine system in 4 parts. There's a lot of information, so maybe you want to do a part a day or something like that, and then just kind of work through the worksheet at your own speed. Try not to be too overwhelmed, and if you have questions, make sure that you do ask. So you have your druggy presentation that you guys are going to be working on for the following week, and I'll see you on the other side.